On January 7, 1942, Adolf Hitler sat at his headquarters in East Prussia and spoke with complete confidence about America's future. To him, the United States was not a serious threat. It was, he said, a decayed society, divided by race, weakened by social inequality, and corrupted by what he called Jewish influence. In Hitler's mind, such a nation could not endure the strain of a modern war. It would fracture under pressure. It would not fight with discipline or sacrifice. Above all, it would not produce what war demanded. 7,000 miles away, in a small office at a shipyard in Richmond, California, a 57-year-old industrialist named Henry Kaiser was sketching ideas on hotel notepaper. Kaiser had never built a ship in his life. He had built dams, bridges, and highways, but ships were considered different. Traditional shipbuilders insisted a cargo vessel required at least 8 months to construct. Kaiser studied his rough drawing, turned to his team, and calmly said they would build one in 4 days. Hitler believed America was weak. Kaiser was about to prove that belief catastrophically wrong. The German misjudgment of America did not begin in 1942. For years before the war, German military intelligence studied the United States. Their reports were consistent and dismissive. America, they concluded, was a nation of consumers and businessmen, not soldiers. Its army in 1939 was smaller than Portugal's. Its factories produced cars and refrigerators, not tanks or aircraft. Its people had lived comfortably through the Great Depression and had no appetite for sacrifice. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that the United States would soon produce 50,000 military aircraft per year, German commanders laughed. In 1939, America had produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft in total. Increasing that output nearly 20-fold seemed absurd. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was particularly contemptuous. He had built Germany's air force into the most feared in Europe, and believed he understood industrial reality. Aircraft required precision engineering, specialized metals, trained workers, and years of experience. America, he believed, had none of these advantages. The idea that automobile factories could suddenly build combat aircraft struck him as fantasy. German generals also remembered the First World War. American troops had arrived late, suffered fewer casualties than European armies, and played little role in shaping strategy. To German minds, the Green Doughboys had been adequate, but not impressive. Hitler himself often remarked that America had not made real sacrifices in the Great War and therefore lacked true fighting spirit. Underlying all of this was Nazi racial ideology. Hitler believed national strength came from racial purity and unity. Germany, in his view, possessed both. America did not. It was, he said, a mass of immigrants, Jews, African Americans, and people of mixed origins, without a shared identity. How could such a nation fight a prolonged war? But this analysis contained a fatal flaw. Germany judged America by its peacetime appearance, not by its wartime potential. They saw factories making consumer goods and assumed they could not make weapons. They saw a diverse population and assumed diversity meant weakness. They saw a nation unprepared for war and concluded it could not prepare in time. They were wrong about everything. Even before America formally entered the war, the transformation had begun. In the summer of 1940, after France fell and Britain stood alone, Roosevelt issued a challenge to American industry. It was not a speech, it was a command. The nation would become what he called the arsenal of democracy. Automobile factories stopped making cars. Appliance plants stopped making refrigerators. Assembly lines that once produced comfort were converted to produce destruction. In 1941 alone, over 3 million automobiles rolled off American assembly lines. Over the next 4 years, only 139 more would be built. The rest of the industry was redirected entirely toward war. Chrysler produced tank fuselages. General Motors built aircraft engines, guns, trucks, and armored vehicles. Packard manufactured Rolls-Royce engines for British fighter planes. Companies that had never made anything more dangerous than a toaster began producing ammunition. This conversion succeeded because American industry possessed something German planners failed to understand: standardization and interchangeable parts. For decades, American manufacturers had perfected mass production. A part made in Ohio would fit a machine assembled in Michigan and function flawlessly in California. That civilian efficiency was now applied to war. Critics argued aircraft and ships were too complex for such methods. A heavy bomber contained over 1 million parts. A ship was a floating system of steel, engines, wiring, and life support. This was not automobile work. Henry Kaiser ignored them. To Kaiser, shipbuilding was not a craft, it was a process. Every task could be analyzed, simplified, and accelerated. Traditional shipyards relied on skilled labor learned through years of apprenticeship. Kaiser did not have years. He redesigned the entire system so workers could be trained in days. He replaced rivets with welding. He broke ships into prefabricated modules built simultaneously in different locations. He invested heavily in machinery to reduce dependence on specialized labor. Critics warned his ships would sink. Instead, they proved stronger and had half the defect rate of traditional vessels. Kaiser also understood people. He recruited workers from across America: farmers displaced by drought, unemployed factory hands, women who had never worked outside the home, and African Americans seeking opportunity, denied in the segregated South. He built housing, child care centers, and health clinics to keep production uninterrupted. At Kaiser's Richmond shipyards, men and women who had never seen the ocean learned to build ships in weeks. A welder could be trained in 10 days. Within a month, they were productive. Nearly a third of the workforce were women, symbols of a mobilization German planners had never imagined. By 1941, it took 230 days to build a Liberty ship. By 1942, Kaiser's yards reduced that to 45 days, then 30, then 20. In November 1942, the Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days and 15 hours, from keel to launch. That single achievement marked the moment Germany's assumptions collapsed. While German submarines prowled the Atlantic, sinking Allied ships at terrifying rates, American shipyards were replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted. What Germany believed was a war of attrition was becoming a war of arithmetic, and Germany was losing the math. Hitler had dismissed America as weak, divided, and incapable of sustained effort. What he failed to see was a nation that, once awakened, could reorganize its entire economy, retrain millions of ordinary people, and turn industrial chaos into unstoppable momentum. The sleeping giant was no longer asleep. As Henry Kaiser's shipyards accelerated production, German submarines moved into American waters with deadly confidence. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, believed he had found the key to victory. Britain, he argued, could not survive without imported food, fuel, and raw materials. If submarines sank merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them, Britain would starve, and the war would end. In early 1942, it appeared Donitz was right. German U-boats began what they called the Second Happy Time. American coastal defenses were unprepared. Cities along the East Coast failed to enforce blackouts. Merchant ships sailed independently instead of in convoys. At night, U-boat commanders could see the silhouettes of tankers and freighters outlined by city lights. Captain Reinhard Hartigen of U-123 was among the first to exploit this chaos. In January 1942, he sank ships so close to shore that flames reflected off beachfront hotels. Oil tankers burned within sight of Florida beaches. Cargo vessels went down near New Jersey, watched by stunned civilians. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, German submarines sank nearly 400 ships in American coastal waters. Oil meant for Allied tanks washed ashore. Food destined for Britain vanished beneath the waves. Strategic materials essential for war disappeared into the Atlantic. Donitz believed victory was within reach. His calculations were precise. To strangle Britain, he needed to sink 700,000 tons of shipping per month. In 1942, his submarines came dangerously close to that figure. German naval intelligence celebrated. The Allies appeared slow, disorganized, and helpless at sea. But while the U-boats hunted, American shipyards worked. In 1942, the United States launched 8 million tons of new shipping. In 1943, that figure more than doubled to 19 million tons. By late 1943, new ships entered service faster than submarines could destroy them. For every vessel sunk, 2 more appeared. The arithmetic that had once favored Germany now turned mercilessly against it. Dönitz watched the numbers with growing alarm. His submarines were achieving kill rates that would have won the First World War. But this was no longer 1917. America was producing ships at a pace no navy had ever faced. Worse still, the Americans were learning. The early disasters off the East Coast forced rapid adaptation. Convoy systems were implemented. Long-range patrol aircraft began sweeping shipping lanes. Radar and improved sonar reduced the ocean's invisibility. Escort carriers filled the air gaps submarines once exploited. By May 1943, the turning point arrived. In a single month, Germany lost 43 U-boats, an unsustainable rate. The tonnage sunk no longer justified the cost. Dönitz withdrew his submarines from the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic, the war Germany had to win, was lost. The U-boat crews returned to occupied France in shock. They had gone to sea believing they were strangling the Allies. They came back knowing the opposite was true. Allied convoys now sailed under constant air cover. Escorts hunted relentlessly. The technological advantage that once belonged to Germany was gone. The same pattern soon appeared in the air. Outside Detroit stood Willow Run, a factory unlike anything the world had ever seen. Covering more than 3.5 million square feet, it was the largest building under one roof on Earth. Its purpose was to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber more complex than any machine Ford Motor Company had ever built. Aircraft manufacturing had traditionally been slow and artisanal. Bombers were assembled outdoors by hand, using techniques unchanged for decades. Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, found the process primitive. He proposed something radical: build bombers on a moving assembly line, just like cars. Critics called the idea insane. Aircraft required tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. A car with minor flaws might rattle. A bomber with flaws would crash. The B-24 contained over 1 million parts and more than 300,000 rivets in hundreds of sizes. Even experienced aircraft companies struggled with such complexity. Ford struggled too, at first. Design changes from the military constantly disrupted production. Workers had to learn entirely new skills. The press mocked the project, calling it Will It Run instead of Willow Run. Even Senator Harry Truman questioned whether Ford could deliver. Ford responded the only way it knew how, with scale and stubbornness. 200 engineers worked around the clock converting hand-drawn aircraft sketches into precise manufacturing specifications. When design changes made thousands of drawings obsolete, they started over without complaint. Ford decentralized production, creating a vast network of subcontractors. Engines came from Buick, propellers from Connecticut, landing gear from Ohio. By 1944, the problems were solved. Willow Run produced one B-24 every 63 minutes. In April 1944 alone, the plant turned out 453 bombers. At one point, 100 completed aircraft flew away in just 72 hours. The Army Air Forces eventually asked Ford to slow down. There was nowhere to park all the planes. German intelligence had dismissed such production claims as propaganda. They were not propaganda. They were reality. In 1944, the United States produced over 96,000 military aircraft, more than Japan built during the entire war. Between 1940 and 1945, America manufactured nearly 300,000 aircraft, accounting for roughly two-thirds of all Allied air power. At peak production, American factories built more aircraft in 1 month than Germany possessed at the start of the war. The implications were devastating for the Luftwaffe. German pilots were superbly trained. Their aircraft were excellent. In individual combat, they often outperformed American crews. Early American bomber formations were inexperienced. Navigation errors were common. Losses were heavy, but attrition favored abundance. For every German aircraft destroyed, America produced 3 more. For every veteran German pilot killed, American training programs delivered 5 replacements. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was losing 25% of its aircrews every month. Experience vanished. Young pilots flew their first combat missions with barely 100 hours in the cockpit. When the P-51 Mustang arrived with its long range and deadly efficiency, the equation became hopeless. Bombers could now reach Berlin with full fighter escort. The skies belonged to the Allies. Germany's strategy had depended on winning quickly, before American production could matter. That window had closed. The war was no longer decided by tactical brilliance or individual courage alone. It was decided by factories, logistics, and learning speed. Germany could fight superbly. It could not fight endlessly. And the Americans were just getting started. Part 3 will move from industry to the battlefield. America's first major land defeat at Kasserine Pass, and the shockingly fast recovery that stunned German commanders. In February 1943, American ground forces met the German army in battle for the first time. It happened in the harsh terrain of Tunisia, at a place that would become infamous, Kasserine Pass. To German commanders, the encounter seemed to confirm everything they believed about American weakness. The U.S. Army units deployed in North Africa were new, inexperienced, and untested. Many soldiers had never fired their weapons in combat. Officers who had trained for years under peacetime conditions suddenly faced a fast, aggressive enemy hardened by years of war. The result was chaos. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of the Afrika Korps, struck with precision. German tanks and anti-tank guns were positioned in classic ambush formations. When American armor advanced, it ran directly into prepared kill zones. Tanks burst into flames. Infantry scattered. Radio communications collapsed. Entire units broke and fled. Within days, American casualties exceeded 6,000. Equipment was abandoned. Command structures disintegrated. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, General George Patton's son-in-law, was wounded and captured after leading a failed counterattack. Similar stories unfolded across the front. To German officers watching the battle, it looked like proof. The Americans, they said, had plenty of equipment, but no fighting spirit. Their soldiers were soft. Their leaders were incompetent. German professionalism had exposed American weakness in its purest form. Rommel himself initially shared this view. Compared to the British units he had fought for 2 years, the Americans seemed undisciplined and poorly coordinated. Their artillery was badly positioned. Their infantry dug foxholes in exposed terrain. Tanks advanced without reconnaissance or air support. Reports from Kasserine flowed back to Berlin. German intelligence compiled assessments that echoed Hitler's long-held beliefs. American industrial power, they concluded, could be offset by German fighting quality. But Rommel noticed something troubling. The Americans did not collapse the way other defeated armies had. Instead, they learned fast. Within weeks of the disaster, American command structures were overhauled. Incompetent leaders were relieved. Lessons from Kasserine were brutally analyzed. And then came George S. Patton. Patton took command of the battered U.S. II Corps like a thunderstorm. He imposed discipline with ruthless intensity. Uniforms were inspected. Weapons were cleaned obsessively. Training was relentless. Sloppiness was punished. Confidence was rebuilt through action. But Patton did more than shout and threaten. He studied why the Americans had failed. Artillery coordination was corrected. Forward observers were repositioned. Tank tactics were revised. Infantry learned to move with armor instead of ahead of it. Air support was integrated more tightly with ground operations. This was not improvisation. It was institutional learning. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of U.S. Army Ground Forces, ordered a comprehensive review of the battle. After-action reports were analyzed and sent back to training camps across the United States. The mistakes made in Tunisia became the curriculum for divisions that had not yet deployed. The U.S. Army treated failure not as shame, but as data. Rommel watched the transformation unfold. In later writings, he admitted his surprise. After the initial shock, he noted, American defenses became first class. German advances slowed. Positions hardened. The Americans adapted in weeks what other armies took months to learn. By May 1943, just 3 months after Kasserine, the North African campaign was over. More than 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered, more than at Stalingrad. The same American troops who had fled at Kasserine now stood among the victors. 4 German commanders. The speed of this recovery was deeply unsettling. In their experience, routed units required long periods to rebuild morale and effectiveness. The Americans rebuilt almost immediately. Captured German soldiers noticed something else. American units never seemed short of anything. When German forces ran low on ammunition or fuel, they improvised or stopped. When American forces ran low, resupply arrived within days. Food, ammunition, replacement vehicles, it all seemed endless. Material superiority was not theoretical. It was visible on the battlefield. The lesson was clear. America could afford to lose and still fight on. This pattern repeated throughout the war. American forces stumbled early, absorbed punishment, learned rapidly, and returned stronger. The same troops embarrassed in Tunisia would later storm the beaches of Normandy. The same pilots outmaneuvered by Luftwaffe veterans would eventually dominate the skies over Germany. This adaptability was built into American institutions. Combat reports flowed constantly from the front to training commands. Doctrine evolved in real time. Equipment was modified based on battlefield feedback. Solutions developed by one unit spread quickly to others. The system was messy. It was decentralized. Different units experimented with different tactics. But the chaos was productive. What worked survived. What failed was discarded. German military culture worked differently. Early victories had reinforced rigid doctrines. Initiative was discouraged. Failure could end careers or lives. As Hitler tightened his control, commanders learned that honesty was dangerous. Reports were shaped to please the Führer rather than reflect reality. The same rigidity that had enabled Germany's early success became a fatal weakness. After the failed assassination attempt in July 1944, Hitler's paranoia intensified. Generals were executed. Dissent vanished. Even successful commanders were unsafe if they contradicted orders. Contrast this with the American approach. When General Lloyd Fredendall, responsible for the Kasserine disaster, was relieved, he was not imprisoned or executed. He was sent back to the United States to train troops. His experience, even his failure, was considered valuable. American leadership separated accountability from fear. German leadership did not. As American forces advanced across North Africa and into Sicily and Italy, their effectiveness continued to improve. Combined arms warfare, infantry, armor, artillery, and air power working together became increasingly refined. German soldiers who fought Americans later remarked on their distinctive style of warfare. The Soviets overwhelmed with manpower. The Americans overwhelmed with machines. When Americans encountered resistance, they did not charge blindly. They called artillery. If artillery failed, they called tanks. If tanks stalled, they called aircraft. Firepower replaced risk. This doctrine deliberately minimized casualties. Ammunition was expendable. Soldiers were not. By 1944, the implications were unavoidable. German forces were fighting an enemy that improved faster than it degraded, an opponent that could absorb defeats, replace losses, and grow stronger through experience. Hitler had believed American soldiers were soft. Tunisia showed they were inexperienced, but not fragile. Under pressure, they adapted. Under defeat, they learned. Under fire, they hardened. Germany had gambled that America would break. Instead, America evolved. And the greatest test was yet to come. Part 4 will cover D-Day, the Western Front, and the moment Germany realized it was facing not just an army, but an unstoppable system. When ready, just say and I'll continue. By the spring of 1944, Germany was fighting for survival on 3 fronts. In the east, the Red Army was grinding forward with relentless force. In the south, Allied troops pushed slowly through Italy. And in the west, a threat loomed that every German commander feared but could not stop. It was called Operation Overlord. For 2 years, the Allies had prepared in secret. In Britain, entire landscapes were transformed into training grounds. Villages were evacuated. Roads were reinforced. Artificial harbors were designed and tested. Millions of tons of equipment waited silently behind hedgerows and in ports. Germany knew an invasion was coming. What it did not know was where, when, or how overwhelming it would be. Hitler believed the main invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. The Allies encouraged this belief through an elaborate deception campaign known as Operation Fortitude. Fake armies, inflatable tanks, false radio traffic, and double agents convinced German intelligence that Calais, not Normandy, was the real target. As a result, some of Germany's best armored divisions were held back, waiting for an invasion that never came. On the night of June 5, 1944, more than 1,200 Allied aircraft crossed the English Channel. Paratroopers descended into the darkness behind enemy lines. Many landed far from their intended drop zones. Some drowned in flooded fields. Others fought alone or in small groups, improvising missions with whatever forces they could find. Their objective was simple but deadly: disrupt German communications, secure bridges, and prevent counterattacks against the beaches. At dawn on June 6th, the invasion began. Over 156,000 Allied soldiers stormed the coast of Normandy in a single day. The largest amphibious assault in human history was underway. The beaches were given names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. At Utah Beach, American landings went relatively smoothly. Strong currents pushed troops off course, but they encountered lighter resistance. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., landing with the first wave despite arthritis and a heart condition, famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." Omaha Beach was different. There, the Germans occupied high bluffs overlooking the shore. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery were perfectly positioned. Bombardment from sea and air had missed most defensive positions. As landing craft ramps dropped, American soldiers were cut down in the surf. Entire units were pinned to the sand. Within minutes, officers were killed. Communications failed. Medical personnel worked frantically as casualties mounted. Some soldiers drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others froze in terror, unable to move. For several hours, Omaha teetered on the edge of failure. What turned the tide was not a single heroic charge, but dozens of small decisions made by junior officers and non-commissioned soldiers. Isolated groups moved inland through gaps in the defenses. Engineers blew openings in wire and mines. Naval destroyers risked running aground to provide direct fire support against German positions. Slowly, painfully, the Americans clawed their way up the bluffs. By nightfall, Omaha was secured, but at a terrible cost. More than 2,000 American casualties lay dead or wounded on that single stretch of sand. For German defenders, the scale of the invasion was staggering. Waves of men and machines seemed endless. When one unit was destroyed, another replaced it. When positions were overrun, they were bypassed rather than retaken. The Allies did not pause. Within days, artificial harbors, called mulberries, were assembled off the coast. Supplies poured ashore: tanks, trucks, ammunition, fuel, and food. The Allies achieved something Germany could no longer match: logistical dominance. German commanders attempted counterattacks, but they faced severe constraints. Fuel shortages crippled armored movements. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, attacking columns by day and by night. Every road became a death trap. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, responsible for coastal defenses, was not present on D-Day. He had gone to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, believing poor weather made an invasion unlikely. By the time he returned, the beachhead was secure. Rommel understood immediately what this meant. The Western Front was open. As Allied forces pushed inland, they encountered the hedgerow country of Normandy, a landscape of thick earthen walls topped with dense vegetation. German defenders used it to deadly effect, turning each field into a fortress. Once again, American forces struggled at first. And once again, they adapted. Tank crews welded steel hedgerow cutters onto their vehicles, allowing them to burst through embankments rather than climb over them. Infantry tactics were modified. Artillery coordination improved. Close air support became more precise. The learning cycle repeated: failure, analysis, adaptation, success. By late July, Operation Cobra shattered German lines. American armored divisions poured through the breach, racing across France at astonishing speed. Paris was liberated in August. To German soldiers retreating eastward, the experience was overwhelming. Allied columns seemed endless. Roads clogged with vehicles. Aircraft patrolled constantly. Resistance became futile. German officers began to speak openly, though only among themselves, about the war being lost. Not because of a single battle, but because of capacity. Germany could still produce skilled soldiers. It could still fight fiercely, but it could no longer replace losses at the rate the Allies could. Every tank destroyed mattered. Every pilot lost was irreplaceable. For the Allies, especially the Americans, losses were tragic, but sustainable. Factories in Detroit replaced tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Training camps replaced fallen soldiers. The system absorbed damage and continued forward. Hitler responded not with realism, but with fantasy. He ordered no retreats. He demanded counterattacks without fuel. He placed his faith in secret weapons that would arrive too late. Commanders who disobeyed were dismissed or executed. As Allied forces approached Germany's borders, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was no longer if Germany would fall, but how much destruction it would cause before it did. Part 5 will cover the final collapse of Nazi Germany, Hitler's last days, and the lessons the world learned from the war. By early 1945, the war in Europe had become a slow, brutal march toward the inevitable. Nazi Germany was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting against time. From the east, the Red Army advanced like a storm. Entire German divisions were shattered or surrounded. Cities that had once symbolized Nazi power, Warsaw, Budapest, Vienna, fell one by one. Millions of civilians fled westward in freezing temperatures, clogging roads and railways with desperation. From the west, American, British, and Allied forces crossed the Rhine and drove deep into the heart of Germany. The Luftwaffe was virtually gone. Fuel shortages grounded what few aircraft remained. Trains no longer ran on schedule, if they ran at all. Germany's war machine was breaking apart. Yet Adolf Hitler refused to accept reality. From his underground bunker in Berlin, he issued orders to armies that no longer existed. He demanded counterattacks without tanks, advances without fuel, resistance without hope. Maps removed. Divisions were renamed. Paper armies marched while real ones dissolved. Inside the bunker, the world had shrunk to concrete walls and fading illusions. Hitler's inner circle watched as his physical and mental health deteriorated. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His posture bent forward. Long monologues replaced strategic planning. Anyone who suggested negotiation was dismissed or accused of betrayal. When news reached Berlin that American and Soviet forces were closing in from opposite directions, Hitler reacted not with urgency, but denial. He believed salvation would come through miracle weapons, loyalty, or destiny. None came. On April 16, 1945, the Soviet assault on Berlin began. More than 2 million Red Army soldiers advanced with overwhelming artillery support. The bombardment was unlike anything the city had ever experienced. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. Fires burned day and night. German defenders were a shadow of the army that had once conquered Europe. Teenagers from the Hitler Youth, elderly men from the Volkssturm, wounded veterans pulled back into service. Anyone who could hold a weapon was sent into the ruins. Many died within hours. In the West, American forces liberated concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, and others. What they found shocked even seasoned soldiers. Piles of bodies. Survivors reduced to skeletons. Evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. Photographs and film footage were recorded deliberately. Allied commanders wanted the world and Germany to see what had been done in its name. Any remaining illusion of moral justification for the Nazi regime vanished. As Berlin burned, Hitler retreated fully into fantasy. He blamed generals. He blamed the German people. He blamed fate itself. In private conversations, he admitted that if Germany lost, it deserved to perish. On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony inside the bunker. Less than 40 hours later, on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. His body was burned in the courtyard above the bunker, according to his orders. The man who had promised a 1,000-year empire left behind 12 years of destruction. With Hitler dead, Germany's collapse accelerated. Admiral Karl Donitz attempted to negotiate partial surrenders to the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviets, a final, futile maneuver. It failed. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8th, Victory in Europe Day. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. Families were shattered. An entire continent faced the task of rebuilding from ashes. For German soldiers who survived, the war ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion and disbelief. Many had fought until the final weeks, clinging to orders that no longer made sense. Others surrendered gladly, relieved simply to be alive. For the Allies, victory came without celebration for many. Too much had been seen. Too much had been lost. The war had proven something profound. Nazi Germany had not been defeated by a single battle or a single leader or a single nation. It was defeated by systems, industrial capacity, adaptability, cooperation, and resilience. The United States brought unmatched production. The Soviet Union brought sacrifice on a scale history had never witnessed. Britain brought endurance through its darkest hours. Together, they crushed a regime built on fear, lies, and brutality. The lesson was unmistakable. Military brilliance without moral restraint leads to catastrophe. Early success does not guarantee survival, and systems that punish truth eventually destroy themselves. World War II reshaped the modern world. Borders changed. Empires collapsed. New institutions were created to prevent such destruction from happening again. Whether those lessons endure remains an open question. But the cost of forgetting them is written across the ruins of Europe and the graves of millions.